Russian President Vladimir Putin wins re-election and will lead the country until 2030. We will take a look at the impact for Russia and the world. Hello, I'm Anton, and this is The Heat. It was a landslide. Russian President Vladimir Putin won a fifth term with 87% of the vote. A huge number that was dismissed by Western countries as not being a genuine reflection of the president's popularity. Putin will be in office until 2030.
I'd like, first of all, to thank the citizens of Russia. We are all one team of all Russian citizens who went to the polling stations and voted. And of course, today, in the conditions in which we live, a special word of thanks to our soldiers, to the guys who in the battle line provide the country with the conditions for its development and existence.
But what will this new term mean for Russia and Ukraine? And what about Russian relations with the West? To help us answer these questions, let's bring in our panelists from Moscow. Dmitry Babich is a journalist and political analyst. Here in Washington, D.C., Anton Fedyashin is a professor of history at American University. Becker is the executive director of the Answer Coalition. He joins us from New York. And from Beijing, Einar Tangen is a senior fellow at the Taihe Institute and chairman of Asia Narratives. Welcome to all of you. Dmitry, let's start in Moscow. As I said, Putin has been re-elected by a landslide, 87% of the vote. The other three candidates got a combined total of just over 12%. So the election's over. Putin will be in office for another 6 years. What's the mood like in Russia? What are people talking about?
I think that it was beyond the expectations even of Putin's team. I think part of the reason why so many people voted for him is basically the stance of the West. If we look at the details, which probably a lot of people in the West just don't understand. But for example, just today, I read in the Polish press, they made a so-called investigation of the companies that help Russia to bypass the sanctions and get the spare parts for Russian civilian aircraft. So they discovered several private companies in United Arab Emirates, in Turkey, other Muslim countries, which supplied to Russia the spare parts. And when I was reading this story, I had this thought, actually, what do these people want? Do they want Russia not to get spare parts because of the European sanctions? Do they want Russian civilian aircraft to fall down? Is that their intention? So basically, people in Russia feel so insulted and so badly treated by the West that they forgive to Putin even certain mistakes, obvious mistakes that he made. The attitude is like, okay, these leaders in the West, all of these Macrons, Bidens, others, they hate Putin. They say that his victory is not going to be legitimate. Okay, we will create problems for them. We will vote for Putin precisely because they hate us and they hate him. That means that they underestimate us, and we will show them that we stand behind Putin. That was the mood in the population, very much created by the media environment that you know because you're inside it. And believe me, Russians have access to Western media. And, there are lots of translations. Internet allows us to see the media environment. I think it was one of the main factors behind Putin's victory. The other factor was, of course, something that, again, few people expected. The Russian economy somehow was not very much affected by the sanctions. Most of the people continue their daily lives. It turned out that market economy allows a country like Russia to sustain, pressure from outside. Mm-hmm. I think we are doing, we are resisting the sanctions a lot better than the Soviet Union. I remember how the Soviet Union in 1980, when because of the embargo, we couldn't buy grain from the United States, we just bought it from Canada. and some of it from Australia. Now it's impossible to imagine, that Canada would sell grain to Russia when the United States maintains the blockade. The United States would just simply, find Canada or force it somehow to drop the deal. So now we are withstanding much stricter sanctions because we have market economy. Russia changed. It's the perception of Russia in the United States that didn't change.
Okay, Anton, of course, as we just heard from Dmitry, a very different interpretation of the outcome of the election in some Western countries. In fact, there was a report on the BBC, the British state broadcaster, which said that the 87% number that I talked about earlier on, quote, sends a clear message to Russia's political elite. Take note, there's still only one man in charge here, in control, and that's not going to change anytime soon. I mean, do you agree with that kind of sentiment, that this election, its outcome, and the overwhelming victory by President Putin sends that kind of message?
I think that it's important to distinguish on here between sentiment and fact. The fact is that is the figure that the Russian government is sticking by. And by the way, if you look at all of the opinion polls that have been conducted, both by Russian state pollsters, but also by the Levada Center and outside non-Russian pollsters, Putin's approval rating has been hovering just around 80%. Sometimes a little bit above, sometimes a little bit below. So for anyone who's been watching Russia, the figure is not that surprising. What I found particularly surprising is actually the turnout, which was almost 3/4 of the population, actually a little bit more. I mean, that was stunning. And I myself saw the long line of people standing to vote here at the Russian embassy in Washington, D.C., where I live. So people came out, people voted. The sentiment, on the other hand, in the West about Putin being really the dominant political figure is something different. And I didn't expect anything different from either the British or the American or the mainstream media in the West. They don't like Putin. They don't like his policies. But they're going to have to put up with him whether they like it or not for the next 6 years. So I think that after about 48 hours, sort of this emotional hyperventilation about this coverage, about this election will die down, and then we'll be back into the cold world of realpolitik and actually figuring out how to put an end to the fighting in Ukraine. The sanctions clearly didn't work. Regime change, which the sanctions were expected to trigger in Russia, clearly didn't work, and they seem to have had the exact opposite effect. So whenever everyone wakes up tomorrow or the day after, we're going to be back at the chessboard, figuring out how to deal with Ukraine, with NATO, and with Eurasian security.
Yeah. Just one point, Anton. You mentioned the turnout during this election and the fact that it surprised you. To what do you attribute that high turnout?
I think that most Russians see the war in Ukraine as a proxy war against the West, which multiple Western politicians have defined it as themselves. And they see voting for Putin, even if they don't like him and don't approve of some of his policies. But I think Dmitry has a very good point. This was, strange as it may sound to Western ears, a protest vote against NATO expansion and the West more broadly. And I think that's what accounts for this remarkable turnout.
Brian, Western media and Western politicians were quick to dismiss this election. They dismissed it as a sham. They said, and what they call real opposition candidates were not able to run, and that there were signs of fraud. What do you make of that?
Typical. I mean, very high voter turnout, very strong support for Putin. It's undeniable. I think Anton and Dmitry gave excellent reasons and explanations for why that is. You know, when you think about American history, FDR was reelected president 4 times. That's why the Constitution had to be amended, because he was popular enough that he could win over and over again. But the last 2 elections were while the United States was at war in World War II. And so if the Russian population feels demonized, caricatured, stereotyped, vilified, sanctioned, embargoed, all of which is true. And they're now in a proxy war with the West, and Putin is the leader, the person who has said, we won't be defeated. We defeated Hitler, we defeated Napoleon. This is our tradition. The eliciting of a patriotic response is very normal. And so I think the United States is kind of in a bind right now. We always tell people we are the great democracy, but the Republicans and Democrats just take turns. It's really like one party with two heads. They have the same foreign policy on almost all issues, same addiction to the military-industrial complex. So where's the great variety? Where does Jill Stein or Cornel West or Claudia de la Cruz or libertarian candidates actually get into the presidential debates in the United States? There's no real variety in the United States. You either pick a Democrat who thinks one way or the Republican who thinks pretty much the same way when it comes to foreign policy. So I agree with the hyperventilating comment. This will pass in a couple days. The fact is the U.S. has failed in the proxy war with Ukraine. It was based on hubris and arrogance. It should end.
Dmitry, just one point on the election, and that is on the issues on which it was fought. You mentioned the conflict in Ukraine as well as what is perceived as a proxy war against the West. Were those the only issues that were dominant in this election? I mean, what about things like the economy?
Well, of course, economy was not forgotten, but the war is the main issue because, believe me, it's a huge tragedy for us. And we feel badly not only about our losses, but also about the suffering and the losses of the people of Ukraine. Yeah. I would say that this election was, I think it was more than election. It was basically a plebiscite on the war. Right. People could express their opinion. If you are really against the war, if you completely dismiss everything that was done in the last 2 years, then you could vote for Vladislav Davankov, for example, who said he was for immediate negotiation with Ukraine. He endorsed the candidacy of Boris Nadezhdin, the other liberal candidate who didn't collect enough signatures and who is just a more recognizable face than Davankov. But actually, I don't see much difference between them. Okay. The fact that people still voted for Putin, I think it doesn't mean that the same percentage of the population approves of the decision basically to escalate 2 years ago, because the war started in 2014. Let's not forget it. Yes. Tens of thousands of people died before Putin gave the order to start the advance on Ukraine. So maybe a certain percent of the people, not 20%, but 35, 40%, if they were put next to Putin on February 24th, 2022, maybe they would ask him not to do it, not to escalate. Okay. But now that it happened, this majority, 87%, believe that it should come to some kind of an end that would not be humiliating for Russia. The people are ready for some kind of a compromise, but it should be a compromise, not a defeat, as the West insists, and that's not reflected in the vote.
Okay, I want to get to Einar. Einar, let's look at the Russian relationship with China post-election. Of course, Russia and China share a very long border and also a solid relationship. Here is President Putin talking about that relationship. Let's listen.
The current relations between Russia and China have been formed during the 2 last decades. They are very stable, they complement each other. I am confident that this cooperation will be preserved, also thanks to our personal friendly relations with the President of the People's Republic of China, Xi Jinping.
So, Einar, how is the outcome of this election being seen in Beijing?
Well, it was not a surprise, let us say that. The only surprise is, as was pointed out by my fellow commentators, the number of people who voted for Putin, and also the percentage that was actually quite unforeseen, even by Putin's people. So I'm not going to repeat what was been said by my fellow commentators. I agree with them. I'd like to make a point, though, that this is not unique to Russia. If you look at Cuba, Iran, Venezuela, U.S. opposition has prolonged the political leaders in those particular countries. The U.S. does not seem to reflect on the fact that it's the way that it approaches these issues is not helping it. In terms of China, those who talk about peak China should be well aware that Russia has 13 time zones, enormous resources. China is the largest manufacturer. In fact, its output is equal to the next 9 countries combined. Putting China and Russia together is a very formidable economic bloc, one that is associated with a very, very large market, and that is the global South and Central Asia. So with 2 leaders who are going to be in the same place for the next 5-6 years, it bodes well for a very, very powerful going forward, economically especially.
I know, as we heard from Dmitry, a large part of this election was focused on the situation in Ukraine, the conflict over there. The Chinese foreign minister has been talking about that. Let's listen to what he had to say about that.
China supports the convening of an international peace conference at an appropriate time, with the approval of Russia and Ukraine, the participation of all parties on an equal footing, and the fair discussion of all peace proposals. China's position on the Ukraine issue is consistent and clear. China will continue to play a constructive role in the ceasefire and political settlement of the crisis.
So that was the spokesman there for the Chinese Foreign Ministry. Einar, how key a role will China play in what will probably become a diplomatic end to this conflict in Ukraine?
Well, diplomatic is a process, but you could well have a frozen conflict as well. China's diplomatic approach has been fairly consistent, whether it's in Gaza or in Ukraine. It is to set the table, to try to get people to come to it, and not to insist on what is going to happen at the table, but simply to say, you people need to reach consensus, that diplomacy is the only way to solve these issues. It's not going to be done on the battlefield, as we can see, and it's not going to be done through these political sanctions or pressure, as we've just seen with this election.
Anton, how do you see the conflict ending? I mean, there's one view among many commentators and analysts in the West which says, look, this war is effectively over. Ukraine lost. But there are others who also say that Russia has become engulfed in a forever war, that this is not going to come to an end anytime soon. How do you see it?
Well, I think that the ones that talk about Ukraine having lost this war already, at least strategically, are a little bit closer to the truth, although Ukraine has not been openly defeated. But look, when you look at what's going on the battlefields, what we're witnessing right now in Ukraine is not a stalemate. The Russians are remorselessly moving westwards. They're destroying the Ukrainian army. They're taking highly fortified positions. The town of Avdiivka has been on everyone's minds a lot in the past, month or 2 since it fell. It was probably the most fortified spot on our entire planet, and the Russians managed to take it. Now they're slowly and deliberately moving west. So this will end in negotiations. The longer it goes on, the tougher those negotiations and the conditions will be for the Ukrainians, unfortunately. But there's simply, I don't see a way for Ukraine to win this on the battlefield. There's a lot of talk here in Washington, of course, about the 60 billion funds that the Congress, the representatives are blocking. I think that even when that money is approved, and I have a sense that it will be approved in the next several weeks, even that's not going to make much of a difference because, A, there aren't enough weapons in the West to funnel into Ukraine. Most of them have already been used up. But even more importantly, the Ukrainians don't have enough people to actually use them on the ground. That's why the mobilization discussion has been so torturous, so painful, so complicated, and it has not resulted in a final decision, although troops is exactly what the Ukrainians need. So things are looking very bleak for Ukraine, and the faster the Ukrainians sit down at the negotiating table, the better deal they will get.
Brian, let's talk about sanctions. Of course, in this phase of the conflict against Ukraine, the Western countries, that's the United States and its allies, imposed sweeping sanctions on Russia. That's in addition, of course, to sanctions that already existed against Moscow. Our correspondent, Mikhail Bar-David, has been looking at the impact of the sanctions. She filed this report. Let's listen to it.
Russia's special military operation in Ukraine is now in its third year. Sanctions imposed by Western countries, including the US, UK, and EU, have made it the most sanctioned country in the world. But on Sunday, the chair of the Central Election Commission in Moscow declared Vladimir Putin had achieved a record-breaking landslide victory in presidential elections. In his speech, Putin appeared resolute and defiant.
No matter how hard anyone tries to intimidate us, whoever tries to suppress us, our will, our consciousness, no one has ever managed to have done such a thing in history, and it won't happen now, and it won't happen in the future. Never.
Western sanctions have impacted many industries where imports have been banned and supply chains have been disrupted. Hundreds of brands, including fast food chains, automakers, and banks, have pulled out of Russia. But Moscow has combined several strategies to combat sanctions, such as import substitution and the strengthening of partnerships with allies such as China and Turkey. Some locals say they hardly feel the impact of sanctions on their everyday lives.
Well, you know, I didn't seem to even notice it with their comings and goings. Absolutely nothing has changed. As I lived happily now, I still live, nothing more.
It has become difficult to pay now, but we still have access to Union Pay cards. We commonly use them here, plus some transactions can be done via cryptocurrencies.
In terms of dining and food, perhaps nothing much has changed. That is, it was McDonald's and became tasty and that's it. Now, instead of Coca-Cola, we drink good cola. Basically, that's it.
The Kremlin claims that Western sanctions have not deterred Russia, but instead triggered an internal mobilization of the economy, adding that last year's economic growth of 3.6% is evidence of this resilience. Mikhail Bar-David, CGTN, Moscow.
So, Brian, the initial expectation was that these latest sanctions, or the sanctions that were imposed after Russia crossed the border into Ukraine, would bring the country to its knees, that the Russian economy would be destroyed, it would be cut off from the international financial system, its currency would collapse as well. So what is your assessment of how Russia has in fact resisted these sanctions?
Well, let's start by just acknowledging that one should never underestimate the incompetence and stupidity of U.S. officials who are imbued with experience, where they actually think that Russia perhaps is like Venezuela or perhaps like Cuba. You know, Russia is a huge country. It's the largest landmass in the world. Before Russia became Russia, when it was still the Soviet Union, it was embargoed, it was sanctioned, it was blockaded, and yet it developed to become the second biggest economy in the world up until the time of the demise of the Soviet Union, even with stagnation. In other words, the Soviet Union has the resources and the knowledge and experience for self-sufficiency. At the same time, by the U.S. carrying out this kind of unilateral attack against Russia, I think China recognized, and I think China well recognized, that if Russia was brought down to its knees, the U.S. would just pivot to Asia, meaning pivot to China, and carry out a similar type of attack, maybe using Taiwan as a pretext. So China stuck with Russia. Iran, which is also sanctioned, stuck with Russia. Turkey, which wants to be independent and not treated as a vassal, stuck with Russia. The countries of the global south stuck with Russia. This is a new day. We are in a multipolar era. the 30 years of unipolar domination that started with the collapse of the socialist bloc countries and the USSR, those days are over. But Blinken, Jake Sullivan, and certainly Biden couldn't recognize it beforehand, and so they were using the same toolbox, but they have failed.
Einar, China was, of course, firmly opposed to those sanctions that were imposed on Russia, and that led to some commentary in the West that China was mitigating the impact of the sanctions, that China was cooperating with Russia. But there have also been some, and some would say, unintended consequences. I mean, there's been a move, the rest of the world, which is the majority, apart from the United States and its European allies. I mean, we've seen a search for a new reserve currency with which the world can conduct its trade. Many countries are now using the Chinese yuan to trade with China. How significant is that?
Well, it's very significant to the United States and also to, you know, the international economic order. The dollar has been in place basically since 1973. It was the petrodollar that then morphed into being the, you know, the currency of trade. So at this juncture, people going away from it, it does not help that the U.S. is now, you know, spearheading this idea that they're going to confiscate everything that belonged to Russia or Russian companies and then use that for Ukraine. This sends chills up the, you know, the spines of countries around the world. They know that Washington likes to make policy for other countries, and if they don't, you know, cooperate, that sanctions. And now this kind of action could be in place. So they are all preparing for that. You can look at central banks. They're down to the lowest level of holdings of U.S. Treasury since 2011. And you can see a very marked movement towards alternatives. Now, China, with its 120 plus primary you know, trade relations with countries around the world, is obviously makes more sense to do that in a stable currency that is not subject to that kind of pressure from the U.S., and that will continue.
Dmitry, very quickly, I've only got about 20 seconds. There was an article in Foreign Affairs magazine which says the outlook for the Russian economy, Foreign Affairs published in the United States, the outlook for the Russian economy is bleak because military expenditure is growing and Russia's main exports are not earning as much as they could. Is there any merit to that at all?
No, I agree with most of the things that Brian said. He described the situation evenly. You know, there is global south. It is important economically, so that's the main factor. But I would also add that what the United States is doing is against market economy. It's against the idea of market economy. That's why I'm more concerned about the West than about Russia now.
Okay, that is where we are going to have to leave it. We've run out of time. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anton in Washington, D.C.